Welcome to the Memory Health Made Easy podcast. I'm your host, Dave Norris, and this is episode 21, where I'm joined with molecular geneticist and nutritionist, Dr. Denise Furness. Dr. Denise has a almost 20-year background in understanding the relationship of our genes and our environment, and with a special focus on nutrigenomics, the relationship of what we eat and how it affects our genes, how it affects our expression, the workings of our genes in our body. This is a fascinating conversation where Dr. Denise and I get to explore some of the common misunderstandings around our genes and epigenetics. We'll learn about why genes, your nutrition, environment, and that relationship really matters. What she wished everyone knew about nutrition and their genes. Genetic testing, should we do it? And if so, what are some of the things that you need to be mindful of when getting a genetic test? And when it comes to our bread and butter of what this show is all about, memory loss and preventing memory loss, we get to explore some of the common gene variations associated with neurodegenerative conditions. In fact, Dr. Denise reveals her own risk, and she goes and explores what that means for her and also the applications for people much in a similar situation. Right now, it is very clear we're now adjusting our lives in response to COVID. And no doubt we've moved from a hyper-acute awareness moment to now dropping into some people have really disrupted routines, are feeling stressed, anxious, and even angry. And we get to talk about what are some of the benefits of understanding your genes and what that might mean to you right now. We get to answer a couple of questions from listeners who sent them in with kind regards, and we get to answer those questions. So Susan, if you're listening, we get to answer your question. And I'm going to do something a little bit unique today and do a bit of a listener shout out. Thanks very much to my good friend George for his hat tip, as this would be something fun to do. And this is from Graham. Graham writes to me, David, I do come off the rails every so often, but your guidance is so helpful in getting me back on track. My aim is to keep my physical health running at its best as I mature, and to do what I can do to have my mental health keep pace with me physically. If I can do this, I have a chance to continue to be of some use to this world and those around me. Thank you again for helping me stay on track. Kind regards, Graham. Graham, you're most welcome, and thank you very much for these words, because it really makes my day to hear about how what we're doing is having an impact on those around us. So let's get into today's podcast with Dr. Denise Furness. Are our genes our destiny? Well, let's get into it. G'day, this is David Norris, and this is the Memory Health Made Easy podcast, brought to you by memoryhealthmadeeasy.com. Easy to remember, isn't it? Today I'm joined by Dr. Denise Furness, and what a wonderful conversation we've got in store here, folks, because I reached out to Dr. Furness with the intent to dive into how we can better understand our wiring, our genetic makeup, to then match it to right choices about food, activity, lifestyle choices. And what a moment this is for us all. At the time of this recording, we're in the middle, after the alarm bell phase of the coronavirus here in Australia. And for many of us, we are moving from alarm awareness phase to a grudging acceptance. Maybe there's a bit of frustration and anger. Maybe all the anxieties are now popping up about, I'm not living like I want to live, and there's just tension in my life. And I thought this would be a wonderful conversation. And before we press record, Denise and I really touch base on a few things that I think are going to resonate. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Denise Furness. Thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm looking forward to speaking with you.
Dr. Furness, may I call you Denise?
Of course. It's very formal, isn't it? You can call me Denise. That's what I usually tell everyone to call me. Even in emails, I sort of say to people, hey, you can back off. Just Denise is fine.
Now, Denise, you've got a really fascinating story. Your work is in molecular genetics. What is all that about? And for folk that are listening to this, that don't have a background in biology and cellular biology and understanding the mechanisms of how our DNA gets encoded. Is that a word? Decoded?
I know what you mean. That's the
Thank you.
main thing. I know what you mean. Yeah.
Can you give folk a bit of a background about how you came to be doing such interesting work?
Yeah, so I guess I use the word molecular geneticist to differentiate between a clinical geneticist. So, a clinical geneticist is someone who really diagnoses rare genetic disorders that are linked with disease. And that's very different to what I do. So, I started life as a scientist, an academic in genetics, interestingly in virology. So, very interesting with all the stuff going on with viruses at the moment. But then I learned about this amazing area called nutrigenomics, which is really about understanding how our genes influence our nutrient requirements and also how our genes are impacted by our nutrients. So I was fascinated by that area. Also, working in virology, initially, I absolutely loved it. And right now, with everything going on, I'm very grateful that I understand viruses in such detail, how they genetically evolve and sort of, we say mutate, but just sort of evolve. And I initially loved my work. I worked in PC4 Lab, CSIRO Animal Health Laboratories, where they're currently doing the vaccine trials and the work on coronavirus in Geelong. Amazing place to work, well funded. I used to say to people, I feel like I work on the moon because that's what it's like, going through airlocks and changing, and there's a whole very strict protocol. But what happened over time is, after a few years, my work led into animal work, and I was not comfortable with that. It didn't sit well with me at all. So I was a bit lost. I was like, wow, I'm working in this great facility. I thought I'd be here forever. I loved where I lived down on the beach at Jan Juc. And all of a sudden I thought, I cannot do animal work. Even though it's for the greater good, this is actually not good for my soul. So I was sort of looking around with genetics, learned about nutrigenomics, and thought, yes, this is what I want to know about. I'd always been into health, into nutrition, into diet. So long story short, I was lucky enough to get a scholarship, moved over to Adelaide, started working with Michael Fennick at CSIRO Human Nutrition. He's the guru in this area. 4 years later, got my PhD in the area, then was awarded an NHMRC sort of postdoctoral fellowship, which my clinical supervisor, who was an obstetrician, was involved in getting that grant. And then I sort of moved in, sort of expanding my research, still on nutrigenomics, this diet gene interaction stuff, which was focused on pregnancy health, but not just on sort of B vitamins and folate. Some of the listeners might have heard of MTHFR. I did a lot of work in that kind of methylation pathway. I then expanded into things sort of in relation to sort of vitamin D and antioxidants, and started working more in the hospital with the patients, a bit more of a clinical role. And after almost 10 years, I decided I wanted to move into private practice, because we were actually having a lot of success, but it was in a research space, not out there sort of directly communicating with sort of patients. And I think you heard me speak at ACNM. ACNM have played a big role in my transition from being a scientist to a practitioner. I've had some great mentoring and ended up working in a clinic in Melbourne with Dr. Graham Rabinoff, who's been doing integrative medicine for more than 30 years, and really started working with patients and with doctors through actually helping a lot of doctors that already were doing genetics. So in 2012, I left research, moved into this clinical world, and really at the beginning was actually sitting alongside a lot of practitioners and doctors that were using genetics to help their patients in all different areas. I thought I would work with fertility and pregnancy. That was what I knew, but actually we're working with children with autism, people with chronic fatigue, in the last few years a lot with cognitive decline, which I'm sure we're going to get onto, because at the end of the day, your genetics, your biochemistry, your cellular health, it doesn't matter what the label of the disease is, whether it's miscarriage, whether it's a neurological disorder. When we're working with genetics, it's all about trying to sort of help identify some of these underlying issues that might be affecting your health. So that's my story. And now here we are, and trying to reach a really, really large audience to help them understand a bit more about their genes and what they can do to optimize their health.
I get very excited when I get to speak to folk like yourself, Denise, because many years ago, before I became a therapist, an occupational therapist, I was looking down microscopes, and I was a parasitologist. Understanding and looking at these gorgeously designed bits of nature and how they leverage off different systems is fascinating. But it is also quite scary at times. The relationship, though, between us and our environment is really at the heart of nutrigenomics, is it not? When we think about what bits of information, food, we put into us gets broken down through various different means and enables or disables or pushes our system into a state of either function well, good functioning, not so good, to, hey, we're under stress and we're not going to work all that properly and things might go awry, or turning things on when they shouldn't be on or preferred not to be on. What do you think are some of the misconceptions when we look at this world of genetics that you think, if I had a magic wand and I could wave this across the world and I could help people just get a snapshot, just a moment of clarity around when we're talking about genes and what they represent for us and where those common misconceptions arise about it? What would you say to folk with your wand?
I had a magic wand. I guess what I would like everyone to understand is that, yes, your genetic makeup, the genes you inherit from your parents, do play a large role in our predispositions for health and disease. So they impact your health. They impact the way we look, obviously our physical traits. So, our genes are really important. Basically, they are the instructions. They make us who we are. There is no doubt that they are very important, but they are just one piece of the puzzle, one piece of that, that holistic way that we should be looking at health and well-being. I use the word holistic. I'd be interested if your listeners actually comment here, because while I've been staying at home with coronavirus, I was thinking about starting to call myself, I've never said this out loud, this is, a holistic geneticist, because molecular geneticist can actually be quite confronting and that can get lost in the science. When we say molecular, what we're talking about is these genetic variations, the SNPs, that's what I do. But I'd like to be more thought about it as a holistic geneticist, because the genes only play one part. The nutrition, as you said, plays a big role. So our genes are the instructions, but they need to be, like you were when you were at the beginning talking about being decoded, they need to be expressed. The genes need to be turned on to make a protein. And ultimately, these proteins are then what influence how we look, how we feel, although basically the proteins do all the work in the body. So our genes, the instructions to make the proteins, but to make these proteins, we need nutrient cofactors, zinc, B6, magnesium. I could just reel off all these nutrients. And I said the word protein. So of course we need amino acids to make these proteins. We need fatty acids for those that are cell membranes. We need, good carbohydrates, we need fiber, all these kind of things. And everything works together. It's not just the genes. It's not also just the nutrients. It's the environmental influences. And actually, when you speak to some of my old colleagues that are still sort of scientists working in nutrigenomics, someone actually recently was a little frustrated with when I was sort of talking about what I do. And they said, environmental exposures and toxins aren't part of nutrigenomics, because traditionally nutrigenomics is this diet-gene interaction. But really that what we've expanded, the practitioners that work in this area, we've expanded into this, we're trying to look at this sort of whole person. And we do know that your exposures to chemicals and toxins also heavily influence gene expression as well. So it's a really long-winded answer there, but I guess if I had a magic wand, the magic wand would say, yes, our genes are important. We want to understand them, but we also want to know that our environment plays a very, very large role in how our genes are expressed. So, it's that combination between the two.
One of the things that many folk who listen to this podcast would be very familiar with, which is the ecosystem, the space of which you live in and how you connect with all these different variables, be it my work behaviors, be it the space or home environment which I live in, be it the amount of sleep that I'm having, the amount of movement I'm having, the amount of quality, rich, nurturing relationships that I feel sustaining and connected with, as well as food. And understanding my personal makeups is, I guess, mission 101 of what the podcast is all about, which is to try and help people be aware that health is just not one thing. I mean, the amount of times, and I'd imagine, Denise, you'd have a similar sort of experience about what is the one thing what is the one thing that I need to do? What is the one supplement that I need to have? What is the one food that you would recommend that I eat? And I think this comes back to our observations or messaging over the years around the take this and you will be better. Take this one thing, this medicine, this product, and you will be this. And that misses the point that what we're talking about are being in balance, being in a better relationship with our makeup, our wiring, our cellular information, and making sure that it's bathed and nourished in the right amount of food, with the right amount of activity, with the right amount of sleep.
Absolutely.
And getting that right is about what I guess your work is all about, which is that personalization.
Absolutely. And I think I heard you mention a word too when we were talking about the magic wand. You said misconceptions. And for the listeners who have heard a little bit about genetics, there's probably no doubt that they have heard about MTHFR if they've heard about genetics, because that is something, it is definitely not the most important gene. As we all know right now, everyone's working from home. And here is my little 3-year-old. Hello, darling. Mummy's having a little meeting. Do you want to say hello? Say hello.
Hello. Oh, that looks like a nice sandwich.
Yes. So MTHFR, here is my wonderful husband to make sure that our podcast is now child-free. So, with MTHFR, there are a lot of misconceptions in that some people honestly think this is a diagnosis. If there was one thing I could also clearly say is if you have a genetic variation, remember this is not clinical genetics. We're not diagnosing a genetic variation that is going to cause cystic fibrosis or some sort of rare genetic disorder or disease. We're looking at genetic variations that can have a small, or in some cases even a large, impact on how well that gene functions, how well that gene behaves, and what that means is how well that protein behaves. Is that protein, let's say it's MTHFR, so it makes enzymes or proteins. With MTHFR, it makes an enzyme that functions a little slower. So what does that mean? That means that person probably needs a little bit more folate, or B2 is a cofactor. Let's give them a bit more B2 to compensate so they don't get higher homocysteine. Because what does MTHFR do? It converts folate into a particular form that helps make homocysteine, which then pushes over to methionine and it helps methylation in the body. So with MTHFR, yes, you might have a SNP. That means that you are more predisposed to having higher homocysteine, perhaps some issues with methylation. But if you've got adequate folate and B2, and if we bring in what you were saying as well, David, we don't have this huge demand on methylation, because methylation, we need methyl groups to help break down our fight or flight, our stress hormones, to help with hormone metabolism, help with detoxification. So if someone doesn't have an extreme need and they're getting adequate nutrients, it actually doesn't even matter that they've got that genetic variation. So it's not a diagnosis of disease, and also it's not the cause of a disease. So there are misconceptions too for those that are new to genetics. I just want to give a couple of examples. There's probably 2 quite striking examples. These are quite extreme, but just where really some people are confused. I once read a report that a patient had that said folic acid is toxic for you based on your MTHFR gene. Now, I'm not saying that you should take folic acid, but I just want people to know there is no evidence to show that this is definitely not toxic. I've also had someone come to me and say, I've just realized why I've had so many miscarriages. It's because I've got MTHFR. And it's not as simple as that. Yes, folate's so important for pregnancy, so important. And if you've got MTHFR, it's likely you're going to benefit from a bit more. And this is how we personalize things, but it's not the cause of the disease. So there are some very extreme views or sort of misconceptions. And I think there's so much of it on the internet. It says over and over that people start to think it's true. And I want people to, this is not about scaring you. This is not clinical genetics. It's just slight variations that we can modify through our diet and our lifestyle.
It's such an important point, that, because we're quick to draw a causative relationship, a direct relationship. It makes it so much easier to understand, does it not? Oh, that's what Denise is talking about. I must have X. And that's not the case. What we're talking about here, I guess, is a relationship of how when something is in your body at a cellular level And it is playing out in a way that, I guess, when you don't have the right nutrients to suit you, there are going to be consequences about how your body works. You might be more prone to experience anxiety.
Yes.
And that may be amplified if you're doing extremely strenuous exercise.
Mm-hmm.
And then you feel a sense of depletion and anxiety with something like that. Now, we're not saying, and what Denise is saying is that it is not a direct linear causative relationship. It is like an association of many different factors that increases your risk or to experience something like this. And there are many things that we can be doing to make changes. You know, when somebody has MTHFR, I'd imagine, Denise, that one of those conversations is looking at their exercise exposures or what they're doing in their daily life or what their daily work is like and how they're
Absolutely.
managing those stresses in their life. And it becomes very apparent and very important on how people manage those factors.
And the other thing I'd like to note is that, I never look at MTHFR on its own. So never in my entire career, when I was working as a scientist in a research perspective, or since I've been a practitioner, have I analysed or tried to prescribe based on a single gene. So I'm always I'm thinking about pathways, systems in the body. If it is, what we call methylation, which is sort of a fancy word for folate and B vitamin metabolism, that then goes on to affect all sorts of things in the body. As I said before, hormone metabolism, fertility, brain health, anxiety, all sorts of things. Just like inflammation affects our body and oxidative stress, methylation is one of those things as well. And we know that, MTHFR is critical for that. And I don't want to downplay the evidence or the science around MTHFR and the effect it has, because it is there, but it's there in relation to folate and homocysteine. And then, as you said, it's these kind of indirect effects that it can then have on health in association with someone having a poor diet, having issues with digestion, not absorbing their nutrients, or perhaps they're not even eating their greens and getting folate, or then living quite a stressful life, whether that's because they are pushing themselves exercise-wise or other emotional or work stresses. And then the body has to then, provide more nutrients to sort of help compensate. So, it's about looking at a number of genes. If I was thinking about methylation, I'd be looking at a number of different things that impact on B vitamins, even PEMT. PEMT is something that's linked with choline. Choline's important. And even particularly for when I'm thinking about cognition and brain health, I'm really thinking about choline as well. So we're looking at a number of different genes in a pathway, along with nutrients that affect that pathway, and then lifestyle factors.
I saw a paper come out last week by a Professor Rodrigo Quinan out of the UK, Argentinian. I reached out to him and I said, oh, look, you're from Argentina, but I'd love to have you on my show. So Professor Rodrigo, if you're listening to this, I'd still like to have a chat to you, despite you being from Argentina. The Brazilian in me, or the Brazilianophile in me, comes out quite quickly. But he made this wonderful position around how we need to start to close the gap between understanding our relationship in our body and mind and calling it the dynamic connectome, and this sort of way of perceiving how everything is connected. When we start to unpack us as human beings, it is just not 1 + 1 = 2. There are so many other variables creating this experience of who we are. One of the big things that folk probably come and ask, particularly when they're wanting to investigate their risk for memory loss and looking at those risk factors, would be around, should I do a genetic test? And I remember asking a functional medicine doctor this question some time ago about whether he screens for certain genetic risk markers for conditions like Alzheimer's type dementia. And he said, no, I don't, because what's the point? Well, that was several years ago. And I was taken aback because we now know that, I borrowed this from, I think it's Dr. Mark Hyman who came out with something like this, which is, our genetic risk factors load the gun, but it's the things that we do around it that pull the trigger. And when it comes to our cognitive fitness, our risk for neurodegenerative conditions over time, there are some things that are worth perhaps getting a bit of a bead and read on. But I wanted to open up, I guess, this conversation around genetic testing and For folk that want to go and explore this, Denise, what are your sort of concerns or suggestions or things that people need to be aware of should they venture down this pathway?
Before I answer that, I'm just going to say I love that dynamic connectome. Is that what you said? What a great way. And I think I'm trying to say the same thing with holistic genetics. We're all using these words to try to just let people know, hey, it's not one thing. So I love that. I like that, bringing it all together. So with genetic testing, obviously you heard my sound effects when you mentioned that you'd spoken to someone, and I was like, oh, I guess this is my area of expertise. So it's no surprise that I'm going to say, oh my goodness, genetic testing is so helpful, because this is what I do and I've been doing it for almost sort of 20 years. I think that many practitioners may not agree with me because they're not skilled enough to actually understand the science. And that's where these kind of misconceptions are that we were talking about before. Some people are, making up extreme things or believing that MTHFR plays a bigger role than it does. And then other people don't have much knowledge and might think and go the exact opposite and sort of say, well, MTHFR does nothing. Just know it's somewhere in the middle. And when it comes to things like cognition and dementia and Alzheimer's, oh my goodness, I am going to say right now that everyone, as long as they can learn from this information and feel empowered and are happy to take on those recommendations without it causing them too much stress and anxiety, because some people may not want to be tested. But if they're willing to get this information, they're genuinely interested, I say do it, do it, do it. Now, I say that as a geneticist, but also I think you heard me speak at ACNM. I think this is why you perhaps reached out. There was a lovely little message from you about a talk I gave last year, just after, less than a week after my mum passed away from dementia. It was an emotional talk, even though it was meant to be a scientific talk, because I was talking about, I mentioned dementia and I couldn't help but have a few tears. It was still pretty raw. So my mum was diagnosed with early onset dementia. I am APOE3/4 myself. For the listeners that don't know what APOE is one of the genes. There's probably a handful of genes that I focus and hone in on when I'm concerned about risk for cognitive decline and Alzheimer's and dementia. And APOE would be the one that has by far the most amount of research. And it's a little bit controversial, because at the moment, some people also advise not getting it tested because there are no drugs, there are no medications, there's no particular thing we can do to sort of compensate. But I don't agree with that at all. There's hard evidence from people like Dale Bredesen that just shows what we can do through lifestyle intervention. And I've now had a handful of clients too where we've seen success in reducing cognitive decline, or actually getting rid of cognitive decline altogether. And in my patients who had quite advanced Alzheimer's, she's not cured, but we've been able to definitely improve her quality of life, in that just her personality's back. She's laughing, smiling, picked up knitting needles after years of not knitting, playing with her grandchildren. So her quality of life, even though she still has Alzheimer's, is hugely improved. So what I want to say to people is there is something you can do, but we do not have any medications or prescription, pharmaceuticals. So all you can do at the moment is prevention. Or if you are someone who's listening that's developing a sort of early stage cognitive decline, we, particularly in the early stages, can reverse it. And for those that have Alzheimer's, possibly we can sort of improve quality of life. Genetically, ApoE, as I said, is the one that has the most evidence. It's a lipid transporter, apolipoprotein, and it gets cholesterol and lipids and fats to the brain, so helping with, energy. But also we're starting to learn more. We definitely don't know everything about ApoE. We've got a lot to learn. There's a lot of money being invested in research right now, but it also looks like it actually helps remove, waste products. So being a fat transporter, it's not just about bringing these fats and fat-soluble nutrients to the brain. It can help actually remove some of the, think about, fat-soluble heavy metals or toxins and things like that. So it's a lipid transporter, a fat transporter, and some of us have particular genotypes or genetic variations that have been strongly linked with Alzheimer's. I mentioned that I'm a 3/4. The 4 is the allele, or the 4 is the result that is linked with Alzheimer's. So 3/3, the way that we describe it, is, you could be a 2, 3, or a 4. And remember, we inherit everything from one from mum, one from dad. So you've got 2 of everything. So you could be a 2, 2, a 3, 3, a 3, 4, or a combination of a 3 or a 4. For most of you listening, you will be a 3, 3. About 60% of the population, it depends on geographics, but Europeans, Caucasians, about 60% of us are a 3, 3, and that means you have an average risk for Alzheimer's. Average risk is about 5%. Mind you, different publications say different things. I'm really happy to share a particular paper with you that I'm sort of quoting some of the stats on. It's quite a good paper. So your average people might have about, 5%. If you're a 3, 4 like me, it increases up to about 20%. But the real concern is those who are a 4, 4, or anyone with a 4 allele, but a 4, 4, it sort of jumps up to almost a 70% estimated risk for developing Alzheimer's. And that's pretty scary. So you need to prepare yourself for that. But just remember, that's a very small proportion of the population. According to this really large study that I'm basing my stats on, that claims that about 2% of the population are a 4, 4. I have to say, though, I feel like it's more because a lot of people I work with are 4, 4. But however, I might not be seeing a true representation of the population because people are seeking out my advice, probably because they have this 4 allele, whether they've got symptoms or not. So the ApoE, I think, is something, and I can talk about the other genes if you're interested too, but ApoE is number 1 because it is such a big risk factor. And the earlier you know this, the earlier you can start to do things. And we know that Nigerians, for example, this is a really great example to help reduce some of the fear in people, because I don't like to scare people and cause more anxiety. Nigerians have one of the highest frequencies of this 4, 4 allele. So I've just told you that this 4, 4 is really strongly linked with Alzheimer's. Nigerians have the highest frequency of 4, 4, but they've got one of the lowest onsets of Alzheimer's disease. So this tells us that even though the ApoE44 is strongly associated, it's obviously not a cause. And what's the difference between these Nigerians and these particular African populations that are shown that have high, a lot of them, it's very common to be 4-4, but they're not getting Alzheimer's. The difference is their lifestyle, their diet. They all have low cholesterol. They're very active. They have a high fiber diet. They're not overweight. They're not smoking. And all of these things I'm alluding to have actually been shown to be risk factors for Alzheimer's. Smoking cigarettes, high blood pressure, obesity, high fat diets, things like that, very, very strong risk factors for Alzheimer's. And actually, when you think about ApoE being a lipid transporter, it's actually strongly associated with cardiovascular disease, not just Alzheimer's. So if you start to think about the cardiovascular risk factors and reduce those, bring your blood pressure down, bring your weight down, bring down, the cholesterol. I'm not anti-cholesterol. I know that we could go into a whole debate, but just know that you do want to bring down, LDL can become oxidized, but, think more about your good fats, increasing your HDL. So, if you can make these lifestyle changes, and actually there's evidence to show that if you get all of these lifestyle things in check, you actually then bring, even if you're a 4-4, you bring your risk down when they do these kind of calculations, because it's all about risk. You can bring your risk down to a sort of normal, which is thought to be about a 5% risk. So if you're not smoking, you're not on blood pressure medication, you're exercising, you can compensate. So this is why I say to people, it is, in my opinion, so important to have this tested, because you can start to make changes in your lifestyle. Because a lot of people kind of go, oh, I've got high blood pressure, I'm on a tablet. They get through life thinking it's okay to be on these medications, not realizing that, Alzheimer's, they say, takes about 20 years to develop. So while all these little things metabolically are going wrong, it's not just about having these slight little underlying things. It's actually going to manifest into a full-blown disease, a death sentence. That sounds a bit harsh, but it kind of is. So that's why I sort of say it's important to be tested.
Yeah. And one of the things that I'll often say is it's that sliding scale. We can start to stack things in our favor and reduce our risk of expression by starting to make some simple lifestyle choices. And it's really fascinating that it is the most simple yet the most powerful things that we can do, which is move more,
Mm-hmm.
sleep well, eat a diet that matches what we are designed to do, have nourishing relationships, do things which challenge us and encourage the brain builders to turn up rather than brain demolishers, to borrow Dr. Bredeson's work there. And to start to engineer our life that it is pro-aging well, with vitality, with energy, with clarity, as opposed to stacking things to start to accept. I'm just a little bit more forgetful than what I used to, or I don't have enough energy, or I've got more brain fog than, but that's okay. Isn't that an aging thing? And I think this is the key point when we start to talk about conditions like dementia, which we will see commonly expressed in older people. But this is not an older person's disease. This is a life disease which starts in as early as our 30s and 40s.
Wow, a lot of stuff in this episode. Be right back into it. I want to share with you a little bit about memoryhealthmadeeasy.com and what you can find over there. Programs, resources, and community, all with one goal: to help stop avoidable memory loss. Here's a great place to start. The Memory Health Checkup shows you how to identify your personal risks and also set a map and course about what to do about them. The Memory Health Fast Masterclass gets you out of the gates quickly around applying the 9 principles for memory health for life. Want to work out your brain? Improve your brain performance with How to Train Your Brain. It's a 30-day brain optimizing program. And of course, we've got our flagship community, which is all about support, and you can ask me any question, where I'm your memory health coach to guide, support, and cheer you through the steps to achieve memory health. Come on over to memoryhealthmadeeasy.com/products where you can find out more. Now let's get back to today's episode.
And as Denise is pointing out, it is these choices that we make, when we think about ability to manage sugar in our body, weight, inactivity, diets that are high in fat. This is the standard Aussie diet. This is the standard Aussie situation, the standard American diet, the standard American situation. And I could put any other, first developed type world country in this bucket around some of those dietary and lifestyle choices that people are making. When it comes to APOE4, I'm also aware that there's some literature surrounding and pointing out that it has a immune system response too. And that maybe using the Nigerian population as an observation, that it has a function that helps us survive childhood, or has genetically and evolutionary throwbacks to helping us thrive and grow as human beings that moved from trees onto the savannas and dealing with infection risks. I've understood that it has some relationship to our infection control. So thinking then further, we want to be very vigilant about our health and vitality in reducing our risk for infections, for example, too, if we are to have APOE44 or APOE/4 and 3/2, etc. Is that correct?
Absolutely. So ApoE, the genotypes are linked with inflammation as well. And we know that inflammation in the brain is a risk factor for all neurological conditions: anxiety, depression, dementia, and Alzheimer's. And I'm really glad that you brought that up, David, because, a lot of these genetic variations, we automatically sort of think that of good and bad. So I'm someone, for those of you who have done genetic testing, you might notice on your reports, a lot of companies show the results as red, green, and yellow. And I'm not going to beat around the bush. I'm going to tell you I hate that. Strong terminology, but it really is a misrepresentation, because sometimes these genetic variations, depending on what was going on at the time, evolutionary may have been a benefit. For example, with MTHFR, when you have a slower MTHFR, people tend to forget that, yes, we've got this whole methylation that is converting a form of folate that is absolutely essential to make one of the 4 bases of DNA. So if you've got a slower MTHFR, okay, you might have high homocysteine, but you're likely to have less DNA damage and repair, as long as homocysteine is not too high. So that might be beneficial in something like reducing risk of cancer that we know is linked with DNA damage. So we need to be looking at both sides, and often it's not as simple as good and bad. But I think the issue with genetics is all of us, myself included, though I do try so hard to have all of my foundations in science and the evidence, but we're always trying to explain complicated things in a very simple way. And sometimes people oversimplify things. So, you're right with the ApoE, there could be some evolutionary advantages. There may have been, and even with MTHFR, actually, the 66 TT genotype that we think is bad is actually shown to help protect against malaria, I believe. So, and it's the same with the ApoE. There does seem to be some immune component there. And as I said at the beginning, the amount of research dollars that are going into ApoE now to understand more about it. And we're learning so many things. Yes, it's a lipid transporter, but it seems to be involved in communicating with lots of different pathways in the body. Yeah, I think we need to sort of watch this space as we learn more about it. And I imagine in the next probably short amount of time, 12 to 24 months, if not, the next few years, we'll learn a lot more about ApoE. But getting back to testing, I definitely think that it is worth looking at, because most of us aren't living lives like the Nigerians. And, I think, and to really laser in on some of the, if anyone is listening and there are 3, 4, and are now a bit concerned, just know that, having a high fiber diet, low glycemic, whether that's Mediterranean, keto diet, I want to clear up the fat. I sort of talked about high fat. I don't want people to think they have to avoid ketogenic or paleo diets if that's something that's working for them. It's definitely not for everyone, but some people respond well to that. But often these people are eating healthy fats, which are good for them. Yeah, so there are particular things. You mentioned sleep. I didn't mention sleep. Circadian rhythm is so important. When from a genetic and from an epigenetic aspect, when our genes are being turned off and on, our circadian rhythm and our sleep is so important for regulating these things. If someone has a disrupted circadian rhythm, they're going to be turning genes off and on at different times when they shouldn't be. It can affect their hunger, their eating patterns, which then can affect, metabolic disorders and so on.
And I think that's a really important one that I refer or reflect back to Professor Sachin Panda's work on understanding circadian rhythms, and the terminology or the sort of metaphor that really fits my head, my thinking, and is around the gears. Our circadian rhythm is almost like the stopwatch or the pressing of the button when you start and things start to connect into place and those gears move around. And imagine a beautiful clock and all those various different gears that are sort of in sync. Those teeth of each gears sort of connect and they move in their own synchronous way. When we have a disruption to our circadian rhythm, being our rising and sleeping, our response to light, our response to dark, and the changes that happen in us can throw those gears out. And I guess when we talk about gears, we talk about the cellular processes that are happening here, the ways in which proteins are being created, ways that unlocking things on the cellular wall, the way things transporters are turned on or off, the way we feel, and that might translate to how I feel, how I am emotionally, how I am able to slip easily into sleep, how I am able to manage myself in response to stresses, how my sugar is being metabolized in my body. All these things are affected, are they not?
Absolutely. And another thing aside from sleep that you've mentioned a few times and what you and I were talking about before you pushed that record button, as both of us that are normally exercisers, I'm someone who's pretty diligent, but routine has definitely changed. But exercise, people that have ApoE genotypes and even those that already have cognitive decline, those with the ApoE genotype are shown to be better responders with exercise. And what I mean is that they then have better results when it comes to memory and cognition. So exercise is something that's really important. And that leads me into another gene that I look at when I'm thinking about cognitive decline is BDNF. So brain-derived neurotrophic factor is also something that is very important when we're thinking about brain health. It is something that in our early ages, during development, it helps the neurons grow in the brain. But as we age, it helps us maintain those neurons we have. We want to keep those brain cells. Unfortunately, we tend to lose a lot over our lifetime. And at one point we thought that was it, but now studies have shown, quite good studies, that we can actually start to regenerate some of these neurons. And BDNF is the gene that is important for that. And some of us have genetic variations that mean we have more or less BDNF. So there's the genetic component, but exercise. It doesn't even need to cost you anything. You just need to get back to your routine. I'm sort of having an indirect go at myself here, who's someone that has all this knowledge, but has sort of dropped the ball over the last few weeks with homeschooling and working and all these things, like I'm sure many of the listeners have too. But exercise has been shown to sort of light up the brain, increase BDNF, and actually there has been, growth of these neurons in people with cognitive decline. So some really exciting research coming out about exercise. A lot of people say to me, what type? Lately, I've heard that there are particular types of exercise around cardiovascular that are thought to be better. But from the research that I have done, it really tends to be anything. It's something that people stick to. I've seen studies looking at dance as a form of exercise. Middle-aged women who were experiencing some memory issues and BDNF, were doing dance classes, half an hour, 3 times a week. That helped. Strength training, cardiovascular, whatever you're happy to do. As David was saying before, we're made to move, and this actually stimulates our brain. We don't just get these, changes in our muscles and our body and our cardiovascular health. We're really improving our brain, and it helps BDNF. So, you want that. But the negative side when it comes to looking at levels of BDNF is stress. Stress actually suppresses the expression of BDNF. So if someone is stressed, they're actually going to be producing less of this. And we know, and I've actually seen this in my patients, particularly one that comes to top of mind, the first I had, who thought she had Alzheimer's and she didn't. She was under a huge amount of stress. And then thinking she had Alzheimer's on top of all of that, she was just so confused and her brain was not working. Stress is such a big problem, and it will literally change the expression of a number of different genes. So, and exercise is one thing that actually helps you manage stress. So, so many benefits when it comes to exercise.
We had Dr. Tom Gwillems and Professor Zoltan Sanye on a few episodes ago, who sort of went deep on the role and impact of stress. And I know this is really part of Dr. Tom Gwillems' work, and looking at the expressions of what happens in our bodies, but also the impact on our brains. And to think about how stress impacts not only the BDNF, but it also has that consequence around disrupting our sleep cycles, which is then really introducing that vicious cycle of, well, I don't really feel like moving. I don't really feel like I've got the energy to do the things that are self-nurturing and important for me. And therefore we just compound it further and further. One of the things that I'm aware of with my work around using exercise is, more often than not, it's just about starting and being consistent with exercise and choosing something which is hooking into that emotional factor of pleasure and interest, and with the payoff of I feel better.
Yes.
And because once we're into that sort of mode of doing, it's so much easier to change and pivot to something else, to layer in the next part of the puzzle. And I like to link that when we are moving and raising our heart rate and getting into that sort of effort zone where I can still roughly maintain a conversation, but I'm fatiguing out just a bit, that's the magic little zone that I encourage people to find, be it in dancing, be it in boxercise, be it on your treadmill, be it on the spin bike, whatever. But encourage people to go there, because it appears that we're growing, we're creating with that BDNF, as Denise is pointing out, it is that sort of neurochemical which is creating the conditions to support growth. And so think of that as those baby little neurons, like little sprouts in a garden bed. They're just popping up. But we need to take them to maturation. We need to move them into maturity, which is, what are they helping us learn or remember? And so linking some sort of effort type exercise with something that is cognitively stimulating, be it a conversation, be it dancing, because you've got all these new movement patterns that you're having to remember, and orientation of self in space, or link it with something that's a new hobby,
something that you're applying yourself with after the event, because that BDNF and its associated benefits with all the other wonderful things that happen with exercise, such as those circulatory hormones that are changing our blood vessels. These are the things that are creating the conditions to help your brain grow and thrive. And I guess that's one of the things that I take out when, thinking about the opportunity, the beautiful opportunity that exercise offers us. Stress is a big one right now, isn't it, Denise? I mean, men of folk that have reached out to me and said, I had a good friend that reached out to me and said, look, if I can get my 10 minutes of a podcast that just changes or introduces some calm or introduces some know-how to me right now, I take that, because I'm feeling really close to that edge or overwhelmed. What's your observation around some of those genetic variations that we need to be mindful of? But then what are some of those practical elements that you think are going to be helpful for people to navigate their way forward, especially right now?
Well, I think no doubt, even myself included, we had this little bit of a conversation. I'm pretty upbeat, usually optimistic and a bit of a go-getter, but last week it really kind of hit home for me. We've been in isolation a lot longer than probably most people in Australia. I returned home in February from New York, and my calendar, because I do so much international travel, started changing. And so for me, it's been very real since February. And also, unfortunately, we did get sick. My husband was sick for almost a month. I now believe it was coronavirus. He was too sick to get tested. I was negative, but I initially believed the diagnosis, but now it was just too similar. All of our symptoms were so similar. I feel like perhaps the testing, which we know is not 100% accurate. But, so we've been home for a long time. We kept the kids home because we didn't want them to spread anything. And, last week I thought I was going a bit crazy. Like the mood swings was actually really interesting. I said to my husband, if you were in my head right now, because he is very chilled compared to me, if you're in my head now, I said, you would lose it, because I'm going from I was having just ideas overload, but then almost causing myself anxiety because I was so overwhelmed with these ideas that I've not put in place yet. But my brain was just all over the shop. And he just said to me, you need to go outside. And it's true, I haven't been exercising. I have been on the computer trying to homeschool. As someone that does a lot with the US, a lot of early morning meetings at 6 a.m., also some webinars in the evening to address things from different countries. I've had 2 days out in the garden and I feel like a new woman. I needed a bit of outdoors, a bit of physical activity. And, and I want to share that with all of the listeners out there, that even though I have all the knowledge, well, not all the knowledge, but a lot of knowledge in knowing how I should have a routine, what is going to help me cope with situations like this. As someone who had a very healthy morning routine, an evening routine of downtime, there are times in our lives where all these things change and we just have to go, that's okay. And some of us will have a more stressful response because we are genetically wired like that. It's a good word, David, you said wired. If you've got genetic variations in something called COMT, catechol O-methyltransferase, COMT is one of the enzymes that's really important for breaking down things like dopamine, adrenaline, and noradrenaline. So when you have this sort of emotional, stressful response, if you have a slow COMT and you're lacking in magnesium, which is the cofactor to help the enzyme work, and you're lacking in B vitamins, because I said the word methyltransferase, it uses methyl groups. So that means, remember that sort of, your folate and your B vitamins. So if you're lacking in any of these nutrients and you've got this genetic predisposition, it's likely that you're actually going to have a heightened sort of response, an exacerbated stress response. And then not only are you going to have this exacerbated stress response, it's going to take you longer to wind down. It's going to take you longer to wind down and calm down from that. And you might start thinking, what is wrong with me? Am I going crazy? So if you've got COMT, you're more likely to experience things in that way. There is a positive though, as someone who makes more of all these neurotransmitters that are linked with stress, they're also linked with, learning and concentration. So you might actually have a really good capacity to sort of, for executive function and thinking, but you could get quite anxious. So, just knowing that you have that genetic predisposition, you can say, okay, all right, is this just my genes? It's my biochemistry. It's okay. I need a little extra magnesium tonight before bed. Do I need some more B vitamins? Exercise also helps break down these things as well and helps stimulate COMT. even though you might not want to, just get out and have a walk, breathing, all of these things. And I think if you understand your genetic predispositions, it can help you be just a little bit more logical. You're still going to experience these things. You go, hey, this is who I am. All right, come on, what can I do about that? So COMT, and then getting back to that MTHFR, because that affects that methylation. COMT is a methyl enzyme. So some people are genetically wired to be more stressed and have this exacerbated stress response. So if you're one of those people, get out your magnesium, have some an hour before bed, talk to your health practitioner if you need to know about dosages, and if you don't, just stick with the standard dose, because little things like that can actually help you.
And for the folk that are listening, that is me. I am that person. I've done the genetic workup, and you've lifted back the kimono on who I am with regards to how I am wired. And I know that if I don't participate in my morning routine, and guys, you would have heard me speak about this in a number of episodes last week when we had the gentleman from Overcoming MS, Professor Jelenic, and he was really talking about the power of meditation in his experience of MS and how that has been such an important variable to help create space and relaxation and calm. And for somebody who's, predisposed like myself, I need these tools in my life, these lifestyle tools in my life of a habitual way that when they are absent, I sort of feel it. I feel not as consistent. And that is despite, having good nutrition. That's one tick. But in these moments right now, when our life has been disrupted, my work routine's been disrupted, my home routine has been disrupted with regards to homeschooling, these different variables, my sleep routine has been disrupted. Therefore, I start to fray at the edges, so to speak, and the tools that I rely on become very, very important. And you certainly experience differences in my sense of calm, clarity. I associate it with when I'm calm, I'm much clearer. When I'm a bit more agitated or anxious, I won't have that clarity. And that's how I experience it. But I think what Denise is showing us is that coming up with your ingredients, your tools in your personal toolbox based on what you know about you at a deeper level can really help you navigate these changes in this significant disruptive change right now in our lives. And it can help us navigate moving forward and be the leader for our family, ourselves, our community, even help share with others. And that's, my call to action for many folks is just to, what are you doing for yourself, but also what are you doing for your family and others around you to help them come on board? Denise, I've got a question from one of the people that listen to the show, from Susan. She writes that I've given up on diets, and this is coming back to her experience of weight gain. And yes, I eat fresh foods and protein, veggies, fruit, nuts, etc., even dark chocolate. It feels good to do that now, but nothing in years has helped me lose weight. I'm okay with it for now, but is there a genetic factor that increases somebody's risks, predisposes them to increasing their body size and more difficult to then lose weight? What's your experience there?
So there is definitely a genetic component. Like with everything though, lifestyle is definitely important, but with her, I don't know. You shouldn't do this, but I tend to, even when I start to listen to my patients or I'm reading through their questionnaire, they start telling me, I'm like, I bet you get this, and this. I'm not always right, but often I am. Listening to that, I bet you she has got SNPs within FTO. So that is probably one of the strongest predictors of weight. There's also a number of other genes that I don't think have as much power or strength as FTO, but in relation to our ability to, utilize fat as energy, or how well we deal with carbohydrates, and more to do with the storage of these energy sources. So she might have, some SNPs. PPAR gamma is one to do with with sugars and things like that. So the answer is yes, there is a genetic component. And I think for these kind of people that are experiencing this, it's nice to know that it's sort of not all their fault, particularly when they've been trying. But that doesn't mean just give up and accept it. It means actually, sadly, there is no easy answer. Like with genetics, and all things, there's no magic pill or magic bullet that I can give you. But what I can tell you is that, if let's just say it is FTO, and this is what we do with sort of personalized advice, we can say, all right, well, you're someone who's going to have to exercise more than someone else. If you hopped on a treadmill, both of you had two people with different sort of genetic makeups, different, metabolic types, you're likely to burn sort of, less energy. So you're going to have to go to the gym. You're going to have to work a little harder. You're going to have to think about your diet, and we might have to tailor your diet. You might be someone who is quite sensitive to certain fats or sensitive to carbs. I said earlier that keto is not for everyone, and I believe that there is no one diet for everyone. I don't think we have enough knowledge with genetics yet to really say this is the diet for you, but we have enough knowledge that we can try to advise, but then there's a bit of back and forth. I wouldn't say it's just on the genes, and I'm quite cautious with that because from a media perspective, I have a lot of people that want to do interviews and label some of, the things they do with me as the DNA diet. There's no such DNA diet, but we can start to say, hey, you're more likely to be sensitive to sugars. Let's move you to more a ketogenic diet. Or, you know what, you're more sensitive to fats. Let's put you on a more Mediterranean. And then we can trial things like that. So there is a genetic component, but also, with that 10 kilo weight loss, I'd be interested to know what's body composition. It's not about the numbers on the scale. What's body composition? What's her health like? Is she experiencing pain? Some people can carry a few more kilos and actually be quite well. So I wouldn't get so stuck on the numbers, and I'd try to delve into that kind of thing with a patient like that.
Yeah, and there's a number of other variables that we could really go exploring wide on this, but thinking about also gut health and what's happening there as another factor, and what are some of those previous life history experiences. And that's when we pull out the sort of functional medicine approach with regards to looking at those root cause associations of where people have come from to be where they are now.
You're absolutely right. And we know that people have experienced, past traumas. Weight can be actually quite a protective thing. Are they in an environment where they're being bullied by a boss or by someone else and their body's trying to protect them? There can be a lot of underlying things, and the body might be just trying to protect itself. There could be toxins, endocrine disruptors. There could be a whole host of things that are going on top of those genetics. And, you're right, when we sort of have this functional medicine approach, we want to be looking at all those things. Sleep, the microbiome, we know, has a direct influence on our ability to utilize energy and our weight. So looking at gut health would be absolutely essential in a patient, like in all our patients really, to determine if that's a factor.
Denise, one question I didn't ask you earlier, and we got into testing, and for the lay person who's listening around what tests are out there, do you recommend a good layperson suite of tests, or who's providing good products in this space that you'd be able to point people in roughly a good direction about where they could start to take control of their own situation in some manner? Or if they wanted to do in partnership with somebody, what's a good place they could go to get information and then work with somebody?
So I definitely suggest working with someone. There are some direct-to-consumer testing. I generally tell people not to go down that route because they can get quite confused, particularly if then they're trying to learn off the internet. And like I said, there are some really extreme points of view out there that have spread like wildfire, and people might actually start to be unnecessarily concerned, or there might be more fear. And this is not about fear. This is about empowerment and about making lifestyle choices that's going to help improve their health. So I suggest always working with a practitioner. One of the best reports, in my opinion, but it's a biased opinion, I'll put this out there because I helped develop it. I don't get any cuts, but I was paid to help write the report, was for the bioceuticals report. So bioceuticals have developed genetic testing. I didn't choose the SNPs. Most of them are good. They are lacking a little bit though in the immune side of things. Wish I could just tell you there's this one amazing report. Different companies have different strengths. Bioceuticals are now apparently coming out with a few more to sort of fill those gaps. They don't have ApoE, but the reason they don't have ApoE is because there are some legal grey areas around this, because nutrigenomics should not be focusing on disease. And as we mentioned in this podcast, it's a strong risk factor for Alzheimer's. So how do you put that in a report that might be delivered by someone that's not a medical doctor? Because there are a lot of practitioners that aren't necessarily medical doctors or geneticists and things like that. Other companies test ApoE, but they don't talk about Alzheimer's. They just talk about lipids. And I have a concern with that too. We need to be upfront. So it's such a new and evolving area. I definitely advise working with a practitioner who's done some training. And there are a few. You could go to organizations, like ACNAM, or look for your functional medicine doctor, obviously myself included, but there are a number of sort of people that specialize in nutrigenomics. I'd be looking for someone who specializes in genetics. And if you are already seeing an integrative practitioner, ask your practitioner, what's their knowledge like in genetics, and they would probably be able to prescribe, or refer you on. So, and then when you work with that practitioner, they no doubt will probably have their favorite test, because there is a lot on the market. But generally, Smart DNA is another one actually, but they're quite expensive, that has a lot of genes. They actually have a lot to look at. And there's another company here in Australia, Fit Genes. It's actually got a lot of good immune ones. So, but watch this space, because one thing with coronavirus, when I told you that my head was exploding with ideas, not that I really have the time, but I was thinking I probably need to develop my own report in between seeing patients and doing all this education and being a mum, but engaging with someone where I get to choose the genes, because as I said, there are some great reports out there, but none of them address everything that we would want. So, and you really want to be cautious about things like Ancestry and 23andMe, which is what a lot of people use. They have a wealth of data, thousands of genes, but not often the ones that you really want. And you really need a practitioner that understands the genes, because you might start getting information about genes that actually don't have a big impact on the biochemistry or your health. So I know that wasn't a direct answer. Sorry, I know that wasn't a direct answer.
I think you've pointed out a very common pitfall, is that when, I think many of the listeners to this podcast, folk that are trying to really act in a space of self-efficacy, I can do this, I can take control. What are my steps? How do I get there? And when it comes to such complexity around understanding our genetic makeup and what that means, and as I guess you could probably take away, guys, that in the conversation today with Denise, is that it is a complex picture with many different dance partners around that gene that are going to enable the expression of that in many different ways. And having somebody to walk through that with you is probably a wonderful partnership to start to build, so that you can get on the train tracks to better health without having the guesswork and getting caught in a corner, but more so navigating the maze with somebody who's walked before it, had some education in this space, and are equipped with the industry awareness about how this is such an evolving body of work right now. If we were to have this conversation 10 years ago, it would have been entirely different to where we are today. When I talk about cognitive fitness for life, if somebody said, oh, well, dementia, isn't that just, something that happens, we can't do anything about it, I probably would have been in the same camp as a clinician 10 years ago, thinking about that's what we have in front of us. Moving forward into the future, I'm in a different place now, based on the experiences that I've had in working with Dr. Bredesen, having wonderful conversations with folk like Denise, and also applying this in my own clinic here in Brisbane, that we are looking at what can we do to reduce our risk for cognitive decline in our lifetime. But the payoff is I feel sharp, I've got better energy, I've got clarity, I've got these things that we desire on a daily basis. That's the trade-off when we get it right. But coming and distilling how we get there, it's about building the right team and having somebody who can navigate you to where you want to be.
Absolutely. And I have to say, there are more and more practitioners, and like yourself, David, that's obviously interested in this area. And that is, I only see patients part-time, and I do education in Australia and all around, because more and more people are wanting to get the right information. So for the listeners, just know there are a number of practitioners, particularly in that integrative medicine space, that functional medicine space, that do have experience with this. And I would suggest, checking with your practitioner or someone and asking, so that you can get the right information.
We've had a wonderful conversation today here, Denise. We've touched on your journey into genetics, and you've really highlighted some of the mistruths, misunderstandings, and you pulled out a magic wand to make it clearer for many of us, which is awesome.
I've never done that before. Thank you.
I want a magic wand too. And I guess, looking at genetic testing, which is often the forefront of people's mind about what do I do here? We've touched on one or several pieces of genetics that have been associated with increasing our risk for cognitive decline, APOE being one, being the 4 variant or the allele. And then we've touched on a few others, MTHFR, COMT as well, and a number of others. I'll make notes on our podcast page. So you come all across to the episode with Dr. Denise to grab, these details there. Dr. Denise has also put out there a few references for us, and I'll make sure I'll grab those off her. Denise, thank you very, very much for your generous insights, understanding, and passion for this space. It's been an absolute delight to have a conversation with you today. Where can folk find more about you and dive into or connect with you further?
Yeah, so my website, my business is Your Genes and Nutrition. So please look that up. I'm starting, my goal for 2020 is to become, better with social media. So I am trying to put things out on social media. I'm going to start doing some little tips and a bit more videos to just give everyone a bit more information about this. And yeah, so head over to that. Otherwise, my Facebook page, so if you look up Dr. Denise Furness, I have a business page, and please come on. I'm building this community on Facebook. I actually didn't realize, I kind of was anti-Facebook and social media, but I've realized that's the way the world is moving. And actually, from my personal experience with Mum last year, a lot of people reached out to me, and I realized that actually the internet can actually be a good thing. I actually received a lot of love and support, and it made me realize how much we actually can connect online. So since that experience, I'm a lot more open to social media, plus it's the way of the future. So please come and connect with me on Facebook. I've been putting up a few things about coronavirus. I'm trying hard to respond to people. So yeah, come and connect. I'd love to speak to you. And if you've got any questions, even based on this podcast, feel free, jump on Facebook. As I said, I'm trying hard to respond quickly, but it depends. You might get me on a moment where I'm all over it, or like on the weekend where I was anti screen time for 2 days because I was in the garden. But I'd love to hear from you, and thank you for talking about the passion, because I am quite passionate about getting the right information out there and helping as many people as possible.
Oh, it's very clear, and such a lovely synchronous and partnering message to what we're about here, which is to share more, to create more, and to help people achieve cognitive fitness for life. So thank you very much. For folks that are listening, come on over to the podcast page at memoryhealthmadeeasy.com/podcast and see the wonderful interview with Dr. Denise. We've got the resources there, the links to her Facebook page will be there, and her website. Denise, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
My goodness, we've covered some territory today. No doubt there is going to be a few scientific terms that perhaps you're not familiar with. And if that's the case, we've put together a bit of a quick cheat sheet and guide over at Memory Health Made Easy /podcast episode 21, where we go through those key points, and Dr. Denise has also made some specific information available to our audience here as well. I've included the show references as we've mentioned in the podcast, so come on over to memoryhealthmadeeasy.com/podcast and grab today's resources, show notes, and a new edition, transcription, so you can follow along with a bit of pen and paper highlighter if that's the way you want to roll. Again, thank you very much for joining me today. If you've enjoyed the show, please leave a wonderful comment over here at Memory Health Made Easy, as I'd love to interact with folk and learn how you're using it. What was your aha moment? And of course, if this is something that's really resonated with you, share it far and wide, because that's one way you can compound what you've learned, but also help spread the message to, I guess, take control of our brain health, to help people be more empowered about what they can do to reduce their risk for memory loss, to stay sharp for life, to have full, abundant energy, to have clarity, to have their brain mojo working for them right now. It doesn't have to wait till tomorrow. It doesn't have to wait until the cart starts to fall apart. Act now, feel better today,
and have a sparkling mind for life. Well, you're putting yourself in a better position for it anyway. Today's show has been a great conversation. I'd love to know what you got out of it. Come on over and leave us a comment. Talk to you soon, and thanks for listening. Bye. If you really enjoyed today's conversation and have enjoyed other conversations on the podcast, Memory Health Made Easy, come on over. And I'm super excited to announce, ready, drum roll. That's right, I've got a Facebook group, Memory Health Warriors. A Memory Health Warrior is somebody who wants to turn up for themselves, their family, and their community, to have abundant energy and to play life fiercely so that we can have a beautiful brain for life, for memory health for life. The tribe's mission is simple. We're going to achieve 1 million beautiful brains, healthy, gorgeous brains, so that we can have memory health for life. And it's for folk who want to go a bit deeper with the content around the stuff that we go through here on this podcast. So join me over on Facebook at Memory Health Warriors. That's right, plural. And come and see what it's all about. Until next time, I'm your host, Dave Norris, and this is the Memory Health Made Easy podcast. Thanks for listening. The purpose of Memory Health Made Easy podcast is to educate and to inform. It is no substitute for professional care by a doctor or qualified professional. This podcast is provided on the understanding that it does not constitute medical or personal professional advice or services. Instead, we would encourage you to discuss your options with a healthcare provider who specializes in your particular needs.